Welcome back to the Boat Cheat. Please do remember to hit like and subscribe to help us with the algorithm. A friend and I were discussing a passage plan the other day, and it raised some interesting points which I thought would be worth sharing, and a cheat or two along the way. The route we were talking about was from Itchenor in Chichester Harbour, along the south coast past Portsmouth and Southampton, through the Solent and out across Poole Bay to go into Poole Harbour to a yacht club there. If you don't know the area, just west of Chichester Harbour you've got Langston Harbour. West of that you've got Portsmouth Harbour, which is a big naval base, and then Southampton Water, which is a big cruise ship and commercial dock. And then the Isle of Wight sits to the south of that, and the bit of water between the two is known as the Solent. The route takes us from Itchenor to just south of the entrance to the harbour, where there's a sandbar, and that's a distance of 5 miles. From there we go 6.1 miles to pass south of Horse Sand Fort, which is connected by a submerged obstruction to the shore. From there to the River Medina at Cowes, that's 8.5 miles, and from there down the western Solent to Hurst Point is 10.6. It's then 15.3 miles across Poole Bay to enter the harbour, and then don't forget to add on the 2.2 miles from the entrance to the harbour to get to your final destination. The total distance then is 47.7 miles. A good cheat here is to think about ports of refuge before you do any detailed planning. The first obvious one is Portsmouth, where there's several options for where to go in a small boat. After that you have Cowes, again with several options. After that Yarmouth, and opposite that Lymington, and then halfway across Poole Bay we've got Christchurch. If we have a hull speed of 5 knots, which this small boat does, then you might think it's pretty obvious that we're going to need to take 9 hours 35 minutes to cover that 47 miles, but I can guarantee that's not what will happen. The reason it won't is because we've got relatively strong tidal flows up and down the English Channel. So obviously the first decision to make is to ensure that you're going with the tide and not against it. So our first priority has got to be to look at the tidal flows to determine when we're going to leave. Well, in the eastern Solent we have moderate currents flowing up the eastern Solent and also going up into Southampton Water, where they bounce back a little bit and we get some confusing flows. The western Solent is much narrower than the eastern Solent, and so the water is funneled into a smaller pipe, and therefore it has to go faster to go down it. The very narrowest part is Hurst Narrows, down by Hurst Point at the western end of the Solent, and there the flow can be as much as 4.5 knots. So in a boat that does 5 knots, you can see clearly that you don't want to be there against the current. The next cheat is to think about the conditions you're going to see. We have prevailing southwesterly winds in this region, and so if we plan to get to Hurst Narrows with a strong following tide, that would be wind against tide, so it would be very uncomfortable in a small open boat. So I would personally avoid the best of the flow there and try and be at the tail end or the beginning of the tide with no more than 2 or 2.5 knots of fair tide. Hurst Point is clearly therefore a tidal gate, so I would start there and work backwards to the beginning of the leg to see the optimum time to leave, and I would do it in very broad terms to start with. First thing we need to do is to be realistic about our velocity made good, that is the speed we're achieving in the direction we want to travel. Particularly in this part of the world, we've got prevailing southwesterly winds and the western Solent heads west-southwest. So we may do it in one hit, but we may need to beat. So 4 knots as an average with a 5 knot hull speed is probably still quite an optimistic VMG to work on. So we're going to use 4 knots just to do some broad planning. Because of the distances involved, we're clearly going to struggle to do it within half a tide, and so I'm going to start the first leg half an hour or so before the tide turns in order to save the current for when I need it. So this gives me a VMG of 4 knots for that first leg. For the next bit, 4.6 knots. For the next, 5.2, and for the leg down to Hurst Narrows, 6.5 knots. So I'm assuming about 2.5 knots of favourable current average for that leg, because at the far end of it we've got a bit more than that. And again, that might be optimistic. The next thing is to work back from that tidal gate and see what time we've needed to get there. So I'm going to look at elapsed time and total elapsed time, so I can see how long before that tidal gate at Hurst Narrows I need to leave. Well, with an elapsed time on that first sector at 4 knots will be 1 hour 15. For the next bit it'll be 1 hour and 20, so that means we've used 2 hours 35 total. The next leg will be 1 hour 38, which takes us to 4:13, and the next down to Hurst Point, another 1 hour 38, which takes us to 5:51. Well, that's half a tide. So I've already used 6 hours of tide. One thing I know that's going to happen if I get beneficial current all the way is at this point the tide will turn. So for the bit across Poole Bay, I have to assume foul tide, but we're going to work on 3.4 knots, which gives us 4.5 hours and takes us to 10:21 total elapsed. The last bit is also foul tide, so that's 3 knots there, 44 minutes, 11:05 en route. So a long time to be in an open boat, and that's assuming no problems with you, the weather or the boat. For me, that seems like a difficult and rather long and arduous day in an open boat. So what would we do to make it easier? Well, I would simply cheat and pick an obvious place to stop, and since our tidal gate is at Hurst Narrows, for me that would be either Yarmouth or Lymington, and out of preference because it's closest to the route and also closer to Hurst Narrows, I would go for Yarmouth. Now then, we get to Yarmouth and we've had 5 hours 51. We've had favourable current all the way. We can break, tie up, rest, eat, sleep, do whatever, and wait until we've got favourable current to go the rest of the way. We now leave and we're just 1.1 miles from Hurst Narrows, and we've got a favourable current, so we're going to get there in 11 minutes. And then we're out across Poole Bay with tail current 4.8 knots, which gets us there in 3 hours 11, and so we have 3:22 total time. And then favourable current, so 4.5 knots, which means half an hour to get to our destination, so 3 hours 51, for a total time of 9 hours 42. So we can see we've spent a lot less time in the boat, but more importantly, we are much less fatigued, much better rested. And if we've managed to time it so that we've had an overnight, we've also had a pleasant stop in Yarmouth on the way. Hope that little cheat helps. I know a lot of people start from the beginning and work hour by hour through a route, working out where they're going, but I just still believe it's worth standing back from a route, looking at the overall picture, and before you start detail planning, just have an overall idea of where you want to be and whether it's workable. If you like that way of doing it, or you've got a better way, please do comment below, and don't forget to hit that like button and to subscribe to help us keep making more like this.